White Settler Colonialism and the Myth of Investment Imperialism. Emmanuel, Arghiri New Left Review, May 1, 1972, Arghiri Emmanuel. White Settler Colonialism and the Myth of Investment Imperialism. Financial imperialism is a fashionable term. It is supposed to be different in nature from the mercantile imperialism of the 17th and 18th centuries, to have matured during the last quarter of the 19th century and to have led to the informal and then the formal takeover of the world, culminating in the sharing out of the last unoccupied territories: Africa, the Ottoman Middle East and Indochina. This theory has been put to severe trial recently. The huge colonial empires, which had taken centuries to build, broke up in a few years without proportionate violence and without any marked impoverishment of the great imperial parent states or any reduction in their capacity to exploit the rest of the world. The concepts of neocolonialism and neo-imperialism are unsatisfactory. They were devised for argument's sake, in the face of an unexpected situation, and they fail to save the traditional theory. For it is becoming increasingly obvious that political domination, far from having been the condition or even the crowning of economic domination, really ran counter to it. It is a sign of the times that in such a traditionalist context as the I-977th World Congress of Sociology, held at Varna in Bulgaria, a voice should have been raised to condemn clearly and frankly the false identification of imperialism with colonialism and to assert that the colonial phenomenon, from I-880 to the last war, was only an avatar of imperialism, which has existed long before it and which it both distorted and hindered, although it was nonetheless a historical necessity. Unfortunately, a certain piety towards Lenin's writings still prevents Marxists from disengaging themselves intellectually from the influence of a marginal work which never had any scientific pretensions, and which single quote as written rapidly, in the difficult conditions of exile, with no other documentation to hand but the Bern Library. The author himself described it as a simple attempt at popularization, and far from being a general theory of imperialism, it was only an empirical analysis conditioned by a particular historical situation. I believe this quasi-religious attitude explains the repeated misunderstandings and deficiencies of revolutionary Marxism in the face of all the major events that have accompanied decolonization, such as the secessions of Katanga and Rhodesia, the Biafra War, and even the Algerian War and the Israeli-Arab conflict. Marxists seem to circle round and round these problems without knowing from which angle to tackle them. Innumerable many theories are produced that contradict one another, words are refuted by other words, and no current doctrine of imperialism is accepted by more than a small group, even within the great left-wing parties themselves on those occasions when reaction is encouraged, allowed, or simply tolerated. This confusion becomes unbearable when the inadequacy of the old concepts is recognized and people try to save them with a multitude of deductive developments instead of RMLY replacing them by new ones. The main aim of this article is to show up a particular deficiency of the traditional schemas. This is their failure to recognize a third factor that intervenes between imperialist capitalism and the peoples of the exploited countries, i.e. the colonialists themselves. Not only does this deficiency seem to us to be the most topical one and the one most immediately linked to certain present-day problems of the utmost urgency, but its examination will enable us to consider in logical order a whole series of other contradictions between accepted notions and reality. The second wave of colonialism. It is useless to go into the various constraints and inducements that suddenly launched the policy of colonial conquest and expansion at the end of the 19th century. As J. Gallagher and R. Robinson put it, why, after centuries of neglect, the British and other European governments should have scrambled to appropriate 9/10 of the African continent within 16 years, is an old problem, still awaiting an answer. One thing seems certain, however, and is beginning to be widely accepted. Whatever the motivating forces behind this adventure, the advanced capitalist world did not receive any rup/emenligbinet from the direct administration of these new territories. Without going into the details of Kokory-Vidrovich's demonstration mentioned above, or into those of authors like Strachey, Brunschwig, Krauset, etc., one can say that the imperialists' easy renunciation of their colonies and the fact that it caused them no loss or reduction of earnings, provides a strong argument, at any rate a priori, in favor of the theory according to which direct administration of the underdeveloped countries ceased, at a certain moment, to be protable, and from then on added nothing to the automatic machinery of exploitation and blocking constituted by the free play of world economic forces and relations of production. This does not necessarily mean that colonialism was a technical error. As Sweezy has said so well, speaking of British colonialism, though English capitalists may have little to gain through annexation, they may have much to lose through annexation by. The result may appear to be a net loss. What is important is not the loss or gain compared to the pre-existing situation, but rather the loss or gain compared to the situation which would have prevailed had a rival succeeded in stepping in ahead. There is nothing new in this. Impelled by competition and by their internal contradictions, capitalists are often obliged, within each country, to act in a way that is prejudicial to their class and their system. The same is true in the international sphere. Imperialism as a whole would perhaps have gladly avoided the expense of administering the backward countries directly, but each imperialist taken separately had no choice. It was, in fact, on these antagonisms and this competition that Lenin based his refutation of Koskai's theory of ultra-imperialism, according to which the trend towards concentration would culminate in some kind of monopolistic planning on a planetary scale, which would in turn lead to universal peace and the rational organization of the world economy. This explanation is plausible. It is confirmed by some of the most pertinent historical analyses. Fear of foreign interference on the route to India seems to have determined England's takeover in South Africa and her intervention in Egypt. Then, during a second period, and indirectly, the link-up between these two areas seems to have conditioned the English predilection for East Africa, which in turn incited the French to seize the western side, and so on. National prestige, military ambition, retaliation, pure power politics, the various civilizing missions, often provided sufficient immediate motivations for this that costly and irrational colonialist operation. But all this belongs in turn to an ideological superstructure that would not have existed international imperialism itself had not been there already, with a need for economic expansion and exploitation. An independent factor, the colonials. This explanation is, however, neither complete nor sufficient. If the colonial problem, as an avatar of the imperialist process, was only due to the internal political contradictions of international imperialism, it would be difficult to account for the determination of small countries like Belgium, Holland, and Portugal to establish and above all to preserve empires showing a deceit, whose political appropriation ran counter to the properly understood interests of the capitalists. Leaving Portugal aside, it is difficult to see what particular advantages the colonies brought to the great Belgian and Dutch financiers by contrast with those of countries like Denmark, Switzerland, Sweden, etc. 5. That an accident of history led to the colonization of the Congo, through a combination of Leopold I's personal ambition and the lack of resistance of leading Belgian capitalists, is plausible. But that Angola and Mozambique should be passionately clung to by Portugal today against all odds, although national capitalism is practically inexistent in that country, and although the highly imperialistic CM finances the liberation movements of their inhabitants, cannot in any way be the result of investment and monopoly imperialism, whether directly or indirectly, positively or negatively. Things change and everything becomes clear, however, if one admits that beyond the causes that are so to speak inherent in capitalism, there exists another independent motive force that generates the colonial phenomenon, a social factor proper to it that embodies the contradiction referred to earlier. This motive force proper to colonialism is none other than the colonials themselves, and in this category I include not only the settlers but a whole import-export world, including the local stall of the great home-based companies and the colonial civil servants, not forgetting the agents and backers of these interest groups in the parent country. For these people, the colonial adventure was neither a hindrance, a contradiction nor a distortion degree but the mainspring of their existence, and their supreme justification. They benefited from colonialism and therefore promoted it, without reserve or contradiction, and for this very reason they were basically anti-imperialistic, however paradoxical this may seem. From the very beginning they were in conflict with their respective parent countries, and therefore with imperialism itself, objectively so at all times, subjectively so at times of crisis, going so far as to take up arms against it. This highly retrograde and reactionary element led the struggle on two fronts, unyieldingly and wholeheartedly against the natives of the occupied territories, relatively and occasionally, but often very violently against the great capitalists back home. However, precisely on account of its antagonistic relation with big capital, this element was for long viewed favorably, even supported, by the left-wing parties in the respective metropolitan countries. The result was a mechanical transposition into the colonies of slogans from the anti-monopoly struggle as waged within the metropolises. Everything was now back to front. For, in the specific conditions of certain colonies, and notably those in Black Africa, where neither national bourgeoisies nor genuine indigenous proletariats existed, and where there were strong tribal residues and no infrastructure or socio-economic development to speak of, in such conditions the great impersonal enterprise constituted, paradoxical as this may appear, if not the most progressive factor, at least the most positive in historical terms. Few in number, very often integrated both vertically and horizontally, controlling all resources and outlets, enjoying a technocratic interpenetration with an administration whose political and economic tasks merged at every level, these enterprises were naturally impelled towards a planned optimization of the whole. From the point of view of production, they represented the most rational forms of organization; from that of distribution, they were relatively the most tolerable. At the political level, these big capitalist enterprises were able to come to terms with the essential aspirations of the local elite, with Africanization of cadres very willingly, with national independence with greater or lesser reservations depending on the circumstances. By contrast, the settler community could not come to terms with anything, neither with the trusts, nor with the metropolitan country, far less with Africanization or independence. It could be saved only by secession from the metropolis and by setting up an independent white state. The settlers did not fail to appreciate that this was the case, and soon gave it the concrete form of an explicit demand. On the economic plane, the settler community constituted a dead weight if not a parasitic and harmful element. A competitive and anarchic sector, existing at the margins of the dirigism and planning of the trusts, controlling only a small portion of the economy and consequently little aware of the imperatives of the whole, greedy for immediate profit, a great waster of manpower and resources. The settler community also spent and invested a large part of its income abroad. It thus caused an outflow of funds in place of the external nance, however minimal, insured by the big companies and so badly needed by these countries. On the political plane, the relative weight of the settlers and their ability to act independently differed widely according to whether they were in a settlers or a mainly administrative colony, but their $iti0 and their attitude were essentially the same, while their aggressiveness and efficacy depended on the relation of forces at a particular time. There were few of them in the Congo and they were beaten, but only after obliging the imperialists to use all the means at their disposal. They were scarcely more numerous in Rhodesia, but they succeeded with disconcerting ease. In Algeria, however, although they were far more numerous both in absolute and in relative terms, they nevertheless succumbed, though not until they had endangered the parent country itself and obliged a French prime minister to scurry to the radio in the middle of the night to stir up the population against a hypothetic descent of parachutists over the capital. The antagonism between the white settlers and imperialism, there was nothing new in all this, however. The most difficult struggle of the imperialist countries since the 18th century had not been with the natives in their colonies but with their own settlers. And it should not be forgotten that if England is a second-class power today, this is due to her defeat in a conflict of this type and the subsequent founding of the United States. Without this, North America would now be an ex-colony of Red Indians recently promoted to independence and therefore still exploited by England. Marx and Engels did not fail to make references here and there to white settlers, poor whites, etc., although during the period in which they lived the problem was not acute. But Lenin came out strongly in favor of the Boers in 1900, just as Mao Zedong's China recently gave unexpected support to Biafra and its mercenaries. Finally, the exaggerated schematization in which Marxism was conned after Lenin's death meant that no place could be made for this uncomfortable third element in the noble formulas of the people's struggle again, national imperialism. Instead of scientific analysis, we have tenacious myths that no fact, however brutal, will ever shake. This makes for grave misunderstandings and prevents any true dialogue between revolutionary Marxism and the decolonized peoples. To take a recent example, even the mold-informed Marxists did not hesitate to accept the popular version according to which Chambé was the puppet of the Union Minière, the Belgian trust companies and international imperialism. Nothing will be further from the truth. Chambé never represented national capitalism. He represented the white settlers. And it was in this capacity that he was detested and rejected throughout Africa. For this same reason he was the public enemy number one of the trust companies and of Belgian-American imperialism. Of course, if by Union Minière one means the local staff of the Katanga Company, there is nothing to prevent one from saying that Chambé was their man. Like the Belgian civil servants and army oissers, these people represented the parent country before the independence of the Congo, and as such they were on the other side of the fence. The settlers had always called them nigger lovers, the most contemptuous epithet in their vocabulary. But individually, each of them prepared for retirement in the colony, some by buying a share in a plantation, others by investing in real estate, etc. When the umbilical cord linking them to the home country was suddenly severed during the independence troubles, they went over en masse, to the settlers' side. And what more could these local managers and administrators of the Union Minière ask for? From mere agents, obliged to telephone to the head OIs in Brussels before they took the slightest decision, with Chambé and the secession of Katanga they became, from one day to the next, the veritable bosses of the company. And if during the reign of Chambé the Union Minière was forbidden to distribute the slightest dividend, this did not displease these local men, who had no reason to worry about enriching Belgian shareholders and on the contrary every reason to welcome the accumulation of prots on the spot, which would improve the RMS potential and hence their own position. But if by Union Minière one means the Belgian monopoly holding that was behind the Katanga plant, i.e. the Belgian bank in Société Générale/E, then things become quite different. For them, for Belgian finance, and therefore for international imperialism, Chambé was the man to be eliminated, and they ended up by attacking him physica.llyrst in 1962-3 at Elizabethville, under the egg of the United Nations troops, a second time in 1967 by sending anti-Castro Cuban pilots to bomb his mercenaries in Bukavu, and nearly the third time by sending a CM agent to kidnap him personally and deliver him to Algiers. The man who was backed by Belgian finance, at any rate at RST, was Lumumba. He was sponsored in all possible ways by the Belgian Liberal Party, i.e. the party of finance. It was thanks to this party that he was released from prison in Stanleyville in 1958 before the end of a sentence for embezzlement. It was this party that helped him, nationally and otherwise, to found the Congo national movement which was to play such an important role in the events that followed. Now, in July and August 1960, Belgian capitalism was faced with the fail-arm/end plea of a break with Lumumba, following the mutiny of the local army and the other troubles stirred up by the settlers that obliged Lumumba and Kasavubu to appeal for help to the Soviet Union. So it is possible, as Eric Rouleau suggests, that they let themselves persuaded for a time that after all Katanga might serve them, at length temporarily, as a haven of peace and an anti-Lumumba bastion. The Western Rieks may have taken precedence over other considerations. If this is true, their attitude only represented a brief moment of opportunism. Soon, with the neutralization and then the physical elimination of Lumumba, Chambé and his secessionist state once EOE became the main target for the imperialist offensive 3 times the United Nations troops, manipulated by Belgian-American imperialism, attacked Elizabethville against Chambay and his regime. Twice they were beaten back, the third time they won through. And there is one objective truth that stands over and above our analyses, our books, and our mental confusion: the stock exchange. Each time the United Nations troops attacked Elizabethville, the Union/Linéaire shares rose to a marked extent on the Paris and Brussels markets. Each time the attack was beaten off, the stock fell sharply. But militant white settlers had tried to secede long before Chambay. The RST attempt was made in 1946. It was put down with severity, and the Belgian government took measures to restrict the emigration of Belgians into the Congo, to the fury of the colonial organizations. Among other things, it imposed the obligation to pay a deposit of 5,000 Belgian francs. From 1946 to I-960, colonialist agitation grew, encouraged by left-wing papers close to the Belgian Socialist Party, such as L/L'Avenir CA/Anil or LEJLANLE/6/Lair, and opposed by right-wing papers close to the administration, to Heinance and to the Catholic Party, such as the Courrier 1/L'Afrique or the Ecpe de Ftanlajvi/12. Charles Bont, one of the most active leaders of the extremists, toured the Congo openly preaching the adoption of the South African model. The conflict was aggravated as soon as the question of the Congo's independence was broached. As Eric Rouleau says, the Belgian government discovered at least 3 plots in I-960 aimed at proclaiming the independence of Katanga. The conspirators, who were in contact with politicians in northern Rhodesia, had the support of the settlers, as well as of part of the local administrative and security personnel. They lacked one trump card: the backing of Belgian Heinance, which remained resolutely unionist. The imperatives of decolonization. People have been struck by the ease with which decolonization in Africa was carried out, and they have concluded that imperialism was eager to eliminate non-economic liabilities. It is true that the colonies were not or were no longer profitable for the parent countries, and that direct political domination had become a burden. But this negative factor is not enough. Elimination of the cost of direct administration would explain a certain passive attitude, but it cannot account for the extraordinary might with which independence was granted in many cases, particularly in the Congo. This is obvious in the Belgian Congo, where it was suddenly and cold-bloodedly decided to grant immediate independence, although nobody expected it for 2 or 3 years. But in varying degrees the same factor weighed in the balance more or less everywhere. This was not the first time in history that imperialist countries had been obliged to reckon with their own settlers. Selborne showed remarkable foresight when he wrote to Chamberlain in 1896 that so far as South Africa was concerned, he was much more apprehensive of the setting up of republics by the English white settlers than of Boer domination in the Transvaal. What were to be avoided at all costs, he added, were New Canadas or United States. This does not mean, of course, that England's opposition to the Boers was a secondary one. Gallagher and Robinson are right when they say that since Great Britain annexed the Cape, their administration was much more often pro-Bantu than pro-Boer. As de Mangion states, the Boers' hatred of British domination was largely caused by English protection of the natives. It was because they considered the abolition of slavery to be intolerable that thousands of Boers emigrated from the Cape Colony in 1835, starting the great treks that resulted in the founding of the Natal, Orange and Transvaal colonies. Although he is arguing from an ethical point of view, Kermit uses striking terms when, referring to Hobson, he describes the group that has always been the most implacable enemy of backward peoples. If organized governments of civilized powers refused the task, they would let loose a horde of private adventurers, slavers, piratical traders, treasure hunters, concession mongers, who, animated by greed of gold or power, would set about the work of exploitation under no public control and with no regard to the future. The contact with white races cannot be avoided, and it is more perilous and more injurious in proportion as it lacks governmental sanction and control. 15. The same point of view is adopted by L.S. Wolff. Economic imperialism has itself created conditions in which that control must inevitably continue. The European state, if it remains in Africa, is necessarily an instrument of that exploitation of Africans by Europeans. If it withdraws, it merely hands over the native to the more cruel exploitation of irresponsible white men. The whole history of imperialism and colonization demonstrates plainly that the opposition between backward peoples and the small white settler is the worst of all, and our refusal to allow for it in our classical descriptions of the class struggle will not eliminate this stubborn fact, which nds ample confirmation today in the bloody conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Ireland and the merciless // AR in the Middle East. As de Mangion reminds us again, Ireland was Britain's real colony. In the 16th century, thousands of Englishmen settled on the land of the depossessed Irish clans, and Anglo-Saxon property and exploitation were substituted for Celtic communal ways of life. English colonization of Ireland dates from this time, when the wave of British immigrants came over, driven from the English countryside by the enclosures and the substitution of grazing for tilling. This is a striking example of the irrevocable nature of the antagonism we are discussing. After 4 centuries of coexistence, the two communities have not been able to take the least step towards integration. In relation to the Catholics, the Belfast Protestants are neither capitalists nor imperialists, they are still settlers. If they do not demand secession, it is for easily understood historical and geographical reasons. They still demand a large measure of autonomy, however, which allows them to deal with the oppressed people in their own way. As for Israel, it is all too often forgotten that if this country represents a spearhead of imperialism in the particular present international context of antagonism between the two great blocs, this is only a result of special circumstances. Its true nature is to be a mass of small white settlers spreading out more and more to colonize a new ender devil zero pet territory. It is this that makes their conflict with the peoples of the region so ruthless, even where the latter live under pro-Eastern regimes which are themselves the satellites of imperialism. In spite of its circumstantial and unnatural alliance with American imperialism, Israel is a secessionist colonial state. Its foundation was the object of a long and bloody struggle with England, who played the role of the imperialist parent country. The case of Algeria should not be forgotten either. After the FLN was neutralized, following the Battle of Algiers and the immobilization of its regular army beyond the barrage along the Algero-Tunisian frontier, the struggle mainly took place between France and the French settlers and assimilated groups, who as mentioned earlier went so far as to threaten the French state itself. Financial imperialism or imperialism of trade. If these analysis is accepted, a crucial question arises: why was imperialism so bitterly opposed to the white settlers' secession? If decolonization was to come, what did it matter whether it was to the advantage of the native population or the settlers? According to fashionable theory, imperialism's essential feature is the investments of multinational corporations. If this were true, what little difference there might be between the two ways of decolonization would favor the white settler states. Multinational corporations invest a great deal more in Canada, Australia, South Africa, and even Rhodesia, than they do in Tanzania or Uganda. But I do not believe that direct or portfolio investments and capital movements in general constitute the essence of imperialism, and this is what I shall try to demonstrate further on. The essential element is trade. On this level, it makes an enormous difference to the parent country whether power is taken over by the white settlers or by the natives. A native state is far more exploitable, commercially speaking, than a white state, whatever the volume of the trade involved. Britain can sell and buy much more in Canada than in Tanzania, but she exploits Tanzania, whereas she is exploited by Canada. Both countries were British colonies in the past. In one, the English settlers took power, in the other, the natives. The result is that today Canada is much less English than Tanzania is. De Gaulle, who was a leading representative of French capitalism, saw all that clearly where Algeria was concerned. If the partisans of French Algeria had won, Algeria would have been much less French than she still is today, in spite of the profound breaches made by the revolution and the war. It was so that Algeria might remain as French as possible that he fought the OAS, exactly as Salin or Soutelli would have done if they had been responsible for government in France. The export of capital. The question therefore arises as to whether the export of capital is as essential to imperialism as most Marxists have considered it to be up to now. The core of this argument is to be found in A. I. Lobson's theory, which was approved by Lenin, at any rate in its main elements, and remodeled later by Strachey and a number of other economists. It can be summarized as follows: at a certain stage in its development, capitalism is faced with the problem of reinvesting the profits it has saved. On the one hand, the concentration of industry in trust companies, combines, etc., results in economies of capital at the very moment when the elimination or reduction of competition has increased profits and therefore increased the sum of fresh capital formed during each production or sales cycle. On the other hand, income distribution in the capitalist system is such that the consumption of the masses remains relatively stagnant. This limits the expansium capacity of the concentrated industries and therefore their capacity to absorb new capital. Capitalists can no longer nd opportunities for investing their spare profits in their own cartelized industries. So they are faced with a dilemma. They must either redistribute the national income through increased salaries or else maintain the low rate of salaries and the high rate of profits but nd some other use for their spare capital. So the only way of avoiding a blockage of the system is through external investment. And this entails imperialist protection, which leads to the partition of the world. With a view to verifying the historical TMTH of this theory, Lenin identified the foreign aster of England, France, and Germany during the period 1870 to 1914 with the export of capital. This identification is unacceptable here. A foreign investment can be increased by the plowing back of profits without there being any need for further export of capital. It can even increase simultaneously with the net import of capital towards the holding country. This is what happened during the period in question, as we shall show later. Lenin did not invent this identification, of course. Many bourgeois economists used it before him, and they still use it now for the purposes of national accounts. It is then convenient, and frequently done, to include all the interest and dividends earned abroad in the national income, whether it is reimported or not, and to balance the accounts by showing the interest and dividends that are reinvested on the spot as a net export of capital. This is just a question of terminology and accountancy procedures, and everybody knows what it means. The accumulation of international investments. But when it is a question of verifying a theory of imperialism based on the internal accumulation of capital, as in the present case, things change radically. Because, between a situation where capital formed internally is invested abroad and one where on the contrary part of the profits made abroad are reimported and consumed internally, the remainder being reinvested on the spot, T-Bear 1, all Ibdalfarini between Perdoing mer than me can en and ranmring more than one equal j pradmer. And it then becomes quite inadmissible to explain imperialist expansion by the RST situation when the GERS 1 quotes show that the true situation is on the contrary exactly the opposite. If we limit ourselves to the two countries that best represent so-called investment imperialism during that period, England and France, we shall see that, roughly speaking, the former's investments increased in 44 years from 1 to 4 billion and the latter's from a half to 0 ne and 3/4 billion. In other words, England's multiplied by 4 and France's by 3.5. But if one takes into account the fact that after 1871 France had to liquidate part of her foreign assets to pay Germany the famous war indemnity of 5 billion francs, i.e. £2 million, one can say that the rate of increase of these countries' foreign investments between T870 and 1914 was extraordinarily similar, i.e. 400% in 44 years. Now it is obvious that to obtain this result there is no need for fresh capital at all. Not only would reinvestment of returns suffice, but it should normally exceed the required sum by a wide margin. At 5 pet center a capital grows in 44 years by over 850% and at 4% by over 56%. 4 or VE% are the percentages generally adopted by those who have studied the question, such as Giffen, Hobson, Lenin, Frankel, Faze, Seed, Bolu, Leonce, R.L. Nash, Nogaro, etc. They either specifically mention these percentages or imply them indirectly by giving the amount of the national earnings and the amount of investments for a given year. So if one adopts even the lowest GUR-4% one NDS that if England had left the £1 billion she had invested in T870, without adding any exported funds or deducting any reimported funds, these foreign investments would, by 1914, have totaled some £5 to £6 billion. As they only reached 4 billion, one is forced to conclude that not only did England not export capital during this period, but that she imported it. But there is no need to use a more or less hypothetical percentage. We now have the genuine GURs of Great Britain's annual accounts for the period under review, as well as partial but significant GURs for France. For Britain, they are those of C.K. Hobson, but above all the much more precise and reliable GURs of Cairn Cross. Hobson's GURs stop at 1912. Adding them up, one NDS that from I-870 to X-911 England's trade balance, which was constantly negative, showed for goods including gold and silver an overall surplus of imports over exports of £5,517 to £1 million. If we extrapolate the average GURs for the last VE years, we have, for 1914, an overall surplus of imports, in round GURs, of 3 to 8 billion. From this we must, of course, deduct the service sector balance, which is positive. The surplus of this balance was, in 1911, 407 million pounds. Proceeding in the same way as for the trade balance deficit, we have, for 1914, a total of 43 billion pounds. Annual deficit of our 5 billion pounds therefore remains, which England could only make good by using an equivalent part of her external income, leaving the other part to accumulate on the spot. This means that from 1870 to 1914, England not only did not export new funds, but that she drew on her external funds to cover her overall goods and services balance deficit. According to Hobson's GURs, these withdrawals amounted to our £5 billion, which is not far from the £1 to £6 billion suggested above, that was calculated on the basis of a hypothetical yield of 4%. Yet Hobson's GURs are rather unfavorable to my theory, for two reasons. A. He does not take into account any money spent by Englishmen travel.ng abroad that was not covered by ordinary bank remittances. This expenditure would have increased the trade balance deficit. B. He counts among English service exports the expenditure of the Indian government in this country, i.e. the salaries of members of the Indian civil service paid by drafts on London banks. But even if one accepts the idea that England supplied the services of good government to India, it is doubtful whether these services can be included in Ingla.ud's demertir product. And, as we have already had occasion to repeat, this is what is in question here, i.e. whether the Darni-ITIR product really tended, during the period under review, to exceed consumption and hence bring about an export of capital. Cairn Cross meticulously revised all Hobson's GURs one by one, and the overall results he obtained only differed by a few negligible fractions. His statistics stop in 1913 instead of 1911. His total surplus of goods imported up to 191, over those exported is 5,507 to 9 million pounds, the GUR for 1912 is 536, instead of the 5,517 given by Hobson. But he counted the movements of bullion and specie separately, which showed an import surplus of 1z5. The addition of the two sums gives 5,488 to 5 for Cairn Cross against 5,517 to 1 for Hobson, i.e. practically the same amount. All the other differences between the two sets of GURs are of the same order. This is not far from the £1 billion that was found above on the basis of Hobson's GURs and the I6 billion found when the compound interest was calculated. The GURs would be closer still and even slightly higher but for the fact that the year 1914 was added by extrapolation to II Hobson's GURs and to the compound interest calculation, but is absent from those of Cairn Cross. On the other hand, we are obviously at the opposite pole from the dilemma raised by the theory of investment imperialism. Although French statistics for the same period are not so abundant, everything similar rate of accumulation of assets, persistent trade balance deficit goes to show that we are in the presence of the same phenomenon, i.e. a net import of funds. What differences there may be are not sufficient to reverse the direction of the O's. Far from exporting their excess capital, the two main imperialist countries and Germany too, at any rate from 1900 drained part of the capital from the rest of the world, merely by reimporting the income from their earlier investments, and without counting commercial exploitation and terms of trade. Far from being hampered by their limited consumption, they consumed part of the product of others. So much for the famous second period of imperialism, from 1870 to 1913. But what about the earlier period? Before 1870, things are more uncertain. Statistics are rare and less reliable, and estimates more divergent. Keynes went so far as categorically to deny any net export of capital since 1580, when Queen Elizabeth invested Drake's treasure in the Levant Company and later used the prots to found the East India Company. But one thing seems sure. If there was any export of capital, however small, it was before 1870. The most plausible version seems to be that there was a small export of capital between 1800 and 1850 or 1855, and that the situation changed radically between then and 1870. In any case, Britain's trade balance was positive until 1814, and one can say with certainty that there was at that time an export of capital, whatever the amount involved. After 1824, the trade balance became negative, but this does not justify the conclusion that there was a reversal of O's, since the invisibles may well have more than compensated for a few years and produced a positive balance of payments. It is therefore very difficult to situate the break exactly, but it came somewhere about the middle of the century. The failings of the traditional theory. It could be argued that the dominant element of national imperialism is not net capital exports, but the level of external investments, whatever their source, whether internal or external. But in this case, all our accepted ideas about imperialism have to be revised. Imperialism would then have nothing to do with an internal overripeness of capitalism that induced the export of capital. The basis of imperialist expansion would be neither the overaccumulation of capital nor the overproduction of goods. If external investments were an essential, if not unique, dimension of imperialism, we should then have to admit that English and French imperialism has been curiously attenuated since 1914, because after this date the level of their external investments fell progressively until they became an insignificant quantity compared with the 1914 GERs. 5. To say that North American imperialism has taken over the investment role would not save the theory, since tlze prenie/noun of U.S. investment, and even the total amount of I/por of NLL the advan red epatalert round L added together it an inks/loni/imsquini ifi earnten red with J11, in Oerternels of England alone in I914, and an abroli of negligible quantify rorn paired willed the invernanel, of LB, for advanted rapafalen rune tree, in 15,114. To MKE the highest estimate, the present investments of the United States total $70 billion. This seems an enormous sum. But England's 4 billion gold-backed pounds of 1914 are worth, according to the most conservative estimate, 40 billion of T0-day paper pounds. This is the equivalent of 96 billion present-day dollars, i.e. already a considerably higher sum, in Ebola /71, than the current investments of the United States. But a comparison in absolute terms between an England with 45 million inhabitants, at the I914 economic level, and an America of over 2 million inhabitants, at the 1970 level, has little meaning. These investments must be examined in the light of the national income of the investing and perhaps even the recipient countries. We then nd that England's accumulated investments in 1914 represented something like twice her annual national income, whereas the present accumulated investments of the United States only represent the 11th or 12th part of her annual national income. If the national income of the recipient countries were taken into account, the results would be of the same order. Finally, if one compares the total investments of all the imperialist countries in I-970 and in 1914, those of 1970 would come out even. Worse, since in 1914 England's 4 billions must be added to the 3 to 6 billion of the other three investing countries, France, Germany, and the United States. Whereas today there is nothing much to be added to the $70 billion of the United States. What is the point, then, of laying such stress today on external investments in order to explain imperialism, since over half a century ago England did lose/imgle time, better and all the advanced capitalist countries together about liberal/jive time, better. 4. In any case, whether the main symptom of imperialism is the actual export of capital or only the level of external investments, there is no possible link between the accumulation of these investments from 1870 to 1914 and the territorial expansion of the imperialists during the same period. This expansion took the forms of the partition of Africa, the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, and the completion of the conquest of Indochina. But during the period under review, and even after it, these new territories were completely neglected by investors. And apart from the mining areas of South Africa, Rhodesia, and Katanga, where the reason for investing was not the placing of surplus capital but the need for certain essential products, investment in the territories acquired during the imperialist scramble was practically nil. What investments in this list did the regions we are concerned with here? Very few. Part of the 99 to 7 million under the item Other Colonies, part of the 190 to 7 under Rest of the World, and part of the ZGO Private Investments. As for France, out of 45 million francs, 3 were invested in Europe and 15 in the three other continents, Asia, Africa, and America together. Africa's share was not large, and if one deducts 4 billion invested in Egypt, Suez, and South Africa for a precise purpose and not as a simple financial operation, the share of the African colonies becomes negligible. Finally, if we consider the total investments in Africa of all the capitalist countries together, in 1936, in other words, a total of £391 million, which represents about 2% of the total foreign investments of all capitalist countries in 1956. And even if one adds South Africa, the Rhodesias, and Katanga, this percentage only reaches 7 feet 4 inches %. Tauzet is right to say that the supposed need of investors to end an outlet for surplus capital had very little to do with the partition of Africa. 5. At the same time as he advanced the theory of surplus capital seeking external outlets, J. A. Hobson put forward the theory of overripeness that produces a parasitical capitalism and a rentier state. Lenin used this theory in his Imperialisms. But the two images are self-contradictory. According to the RST1, capitalism is incapable of using its own surplus and invests part of it abroad. According to the second, capitalism ekes out its living with the help of a surplus that comes in from the rest of the world. It cannot even be said that the RST situation necessarily precedes the second, nor that the latter is the corollary of an overripeness which Lenin called the last stage and Bukharin the putrefaction of capitalism. After another half-century of further ripening, both the idle rentiers and the coupon clippers have disappeared, in England as well as in France, and it is the active, direct investing capitalists who have taken their place on the Promenade d'Anglais. If, under certain historical conditions, the producer state does become the rentier state, in others the rentier state turns back into the producer state. Without giving any warning, capitalism regains its youth and vigor after its rotting, and one after another the elements that Marxism has periodically considered to be structural prove in time to have been only historical. Conclusions. Production has never existed? No. It is always latent in capitalism, and it does become manifest under certain conditions. In England, in fact, it was relatively as severe before R87 as afterwards. After 1870, the trade union struggle and the rise in salaries helped advanced capitalism out of this dilemma, at any rate to a certain extent. This does not mean that a relapse could not take place again in the future. 2. When this dilemma does appear, it does not lead to the search for outlets for capital but for outlets for goods. Marx explained this very well when he said that overproduction of capital ultimately meant nothing more than overproduction of goods. But if the new capital is already formed, the product has already been sold, in which case there is neither overproduction nor lack of investment opportunities. Nobody has ever had difficulty in placing his capital. However, it can happen that the need to sell products incites capitalism to export goods over and beyond its capacity to import other goods, the exporting country being ready if necessary to transform the equivalent of the surplus into foreign assets. It is then that the export of capital takes place, as a derivative form of the surplus export of goods, even if the credits precede the sales and induce them. This is why the post-Marxian idea of an export of capital taking precedence over the export of commodities does not make sense at all. It is quite another thing to say that at certain periods the export of capital goods takes precedence over the export of consumer goods. This is correct, but it is still a question of the export of goods. 3. It is not the export of capital that prevented the development of backward countries, and Marx was right in theory when he forecast that India would become a capitalist country like England. It is on the contrary the interruption of these exports and the reversal of the O's that is detrimental to the underdeveloped countries. This reversal happens when the servicing of earlier debts exceeds the influx of new capital, and when in addition the little surplus that has been produced on the spot is sent abroad by local capitalists and invested in the developed countries. The essential factor in this situation was the considerable rise in the standard of living of the masses within the great capitalist countries following a particularly successful reformist struggle of the working classes that Marx could not have foreseen. This does not mean that the allocation of this foreign capital is the best one for the national economy of the underdeveloped countries. From if Marxists did not have an unfortunate tendency to bypass political economy instead of going beyond it, they would not have forgotten this elementary proposition, i.e. that the export of capital is nothing but the export of unpaid goods. No other material means for transferring capital between countries exists. 4. International antagonisms cannot always be automatically reduced to the terms of the class struggle. We must pass from factory antagonisms to national antagonisms. On this level, there is no common measure between on the one hand the contradictions of great international capital and the underdeveloped peoples, and on the other hand the total enslavement and even physical extermination with which some of these peoples are threatened by true colonialism, which is that of the white settlers and their states, where these exist.